I've lived a long life, long enough to see the world change its clothes a dozen times over, long enough to bury people I once thought would bury me, and long enough to learn that the hardest things to carry are not the heavy things, work, childbirth, winters, hunger, loss, but the things you cannot set right once you finally understand them. Most of what I've done I can look back on with a steady mind. I worked, I raised my children, I kept my home, I stood beside my husband for better and worse, for sickness and health. I went to church week after week, year after year, through blizzards and heat and grief. 60 years, if you can believe it. I did what was expected of me. I did my duty. I always believed I was a woman who didn't make mistakes, not the important kind, not the kind that stain you. I believed that for decades. But there is one thing, one single thread, that when I pull at it in my mind, the whole cloth of my life tightens around my throat. One thing I cannot mend now, no matter how many times I go over it, no matter how many nights I lay awake bargaining with God like a foolish child. And the worst of it is this: it was my doing, no one else, mine alone. I have thought of it every day for 30 years. Some days it comes soft, like a memory you can almost smile at. Other days it comes like a hand closing around the heart. It does not loosen, it does not fade, it only changes its shape. I was born in November of 1843. A cold month. My mother told me snow fell the day I arrived, thick flakes that stuck to the window panes and made the world look clean and quiet. I was her first baby, her eldest. They named me Harriet. 2 years later my sister came, Margaret, and after Margaret 3 boys, William, Henry and John, 5 children altogether. But in the beginning it was Margaret and me who belonged to each other. We shared a room, we shared blankets, we shared hair ribbons and whispered secrets under the coverlet when we should have been asleep. I can still remember the sound of her breathing beside me in the dark, soft, steady, as if the world could never hurt her. We were raised in Pennsylvania, not far from a creek that ran clear in spring and mean in flood. My father owned a mill there, a grist mill. People came with their sacks and barrels, wheat, corn, barley. The millstones turned from morning to evening, and the sound of grinding was the music of our household. Even when the shutters were closed, even when you were upstairs trying to read your Bible passage, you could feel it through the boards, that steady, patient turning. Grain becoming flour. Corn becoming meal. Father charged by the bushel, 5 cents for wheat, 3 for corn. He kept the accounts in a neat hand, and he remembered who paid on time and who did not. He was a man who believed order was not merely preferable, it was righteousness. We were not rich, but we were comfortable, and in those days comfort could look like wealth to a neighbour who ate salt pork and stale bread through January. We had a 2-story house with 4 bedrooms and a parlour that was kept for company. We had meat twice a week and sometimes more when father was pleased. We had dresses made of good cloth, not scraps pieced together. We had shoes that fit. And father wanted gratitude. He wanted it shown, not spoken. He believed children were to be obedient, quiet and useful. There were rules for everything: when we rose, when we washed, how we sat at table, how we addressed elders, what was proper to say and what was not. No running indoors, no idle chatter, no laughter at the wrong time, no play on Sundays. You did not question, you did not explain, you did as you were told. And if you did not, father's hand reminded you of the order of the world. Mother stood behind him, always. She was not unkind, but she was firm in the way women were taught to be firm, by yielding to the man of the house and calling it virtue. She never said, "That's enough," never stepped between father and a child's trembling lip. She would look at us afterward with that calm face of hers, as if to say, "This is how you learn." So we learned. Margaret and I learned differently. Even as a girl I was solemn, careful, the sort of child who watched her own hands. I made my bed so tight you could bounce a penny, corners sharp as folded paper. I did chores before I was asked. I wiped the table until there were no streaks. I practiced my letters until each one stood straight and proud. I wanted father to look at me and feel satisfied, like a craftsman admiring a finished piece. His approval became my compass. I lived by it. Margaret moved through life as if rules were weather, something you noticed, something you might complain about, but not something that truly changed who you were. She laughed easily. She sang while she worked. She forgot things, small things at first, a half-finished chore, a pail left by the door, a ribbon misplaced. When father scolded her, she apologized quickly and sincerely, eyes wide and honest. And then she would do it again. Not out of spite, not to provoke. She simply drifted. Her mind went to birds at the window, to a shape in the clouds, to some thought that had nothing to do with butter or laundry or father's temper. It irritated me in a way I did not understand, because to me it all seemed simple. You obey, you plan, you finish what you start, you don't make trouble, you don't invite correction, you keep the world neat so the world will not strike you. But Margaret did not seem afraid the way I was afraid. And worse than that, father treated her differently. When Margaret forgot, father would sigh and say, "That girl," with a kind of weary fondness that turned my stomach. If I had forgotten the same thing, if I had been careless in the same way, his disappointment would have landed on me like a stone. But Margaret had a light about her that softened even him. I began to resent it. I began to believe the world was unfair in a very particular way, that it rewarded charm where it should have rewarded discipline, that it forgave the careless and scrutinized the careful. I worked harder. I corrected myself before anyone else could. I watched Margaret and thought, why won't you simply be better? And then I hated myself for thinking it, and hated her for making me think it. As we grew, I became more rigid. I carried father's rules inside me until I no longer needed him to enforce them. I judged myself more harshly than he ever did, and I judged others with that same measuring stick, because I believed the measuring stick was truth. Margaret became, there is no other word for it, free. Not free in the sense of wickedness, not wild, just free in her spirit. She spoke too honestly sometimes. She asked questions that made mother tighten her mouth. She did small things that weren't proper, as if propriety were a fence she could lean on without fear of it breaking. When father insisted girls must ride side saddle, Margaret muttered that it was foolish and unsafe. When mother instructed us to pin our hair a certain way, Margaret would do it, then redo it later in a looser style that pleased her. Nothing big enough to earn a beating, just enough to remind the world that she still belonged to herself. And father let it pass. He would shake his head half amused and say, "That's Margaret," as if she were a weather pattern. I hated that. Not because I wanted her punished. God knows I didn't want that, but because it made me feel invisible, like my goodness was expected, like my efforts were merely the price of being me, while her defiance was somehow endearing. By 20 I married George Bennett. He was a landowner near father's mill, a steady man with steady hands and a steady mind. He didn't gamble, didn't drink to excess, didn't chase foolish dreams. Father approved, and in our house, father's approval was as close as you got to blessing. George provided well. I became a wife and then a mother. 6 children over the years. I kept my kitchen clean, my linens folded, my floors scrubbed. I cooked plain food that filled bellies and did not waste. I raised my children to be polite and respectful. I did not leave things half finished. There was pride in that, there still is. Margaret married 2 years later. His name was Daniel Foster. Daniel was not like George. He was handsome, yes, and charming in a way that made people lean in when he spoke. He could talk his way through an awkward moment as if he were stepping around a puddle. But he had no land, no trade he kept to. He worked where he could, at father's mill sometimes, or for neighbours, or doing odd jobs in town. Money slipped through his fingers. Plans shifted. Promises sounded good but didn't always hold. Margaret didn't seem to mind. She looked at him as if he had hung the sun himself. When she laughed at something he said, her whole face lifted, like a curtain pulled back to let in light. It stirred something sharp in me, envy perhaps, though I wouldn't have admitted that then. I told myself it was concern, responsibility, truth. Before the wedding I warned her. I said she was making a poor match. I said love did not keep a roof from leaking or a child from starving. I said she should choose stability, not charm. Margaret listened with that maddening calm of hers, then smiled and said, softly, "Maybe you're right, Harriet, but I would rather be happy in a small house than respected in a large one." It felt like an accusation, as if she were telling me I had chosen safety over affection, as if my marriage was a calculation, not a bond. I loved George, of course I loved him, but I loved him the way a sensible woman loves, with gratitude, with loyalty, with shared labour. Margaret loved Daniel like a flame loves air. After she married, we saw less of each other. She lived in town. I lived 3 miles out on George's farm. 3 miles isn't far, not really, but when you have children and chores and bread to bake and laundry to boil, it might as well be 30. We met at church, at holidays, at the occasional family supper. Margaret had 3 boys, loud, dirty, restless boys who seemed to multiply their noise just by entering a room. My children were quieter. I made certain of it. I believed good behaviour was a kind of armour. The trouble between Margaret and me did not begin with shouting. It began with small irritations, tiny threads pulled loose. She would arrive late to family dinners. Not hours late, just late enough to show she hadn't tried hard enough in my mind. 15 minutes. 20. She'd bustle in with a breathless apology and some explanation. Daniel had been fixing something. One of the boys couldn't find a shoe. The baby needed tending. Time slipped away. Time did not slip away for me. If mother said 5 o'clock, I arrived at 5 o'clock. Not 5:10, not 5:20. I planned. I left early. I managed my household so that obligations were met cleanly. Margaret's lateness felt like disrespect, to mother, to father, to the whole family. Or that is what I told myself. Then there was her home. She invited me for tea once when her boys were still small. I went expecting. Well, I'm not sure what I expected. Perhaps I expected she would try, at least for company. Perhaps I expected she would show me she could do it right if she chose. Her house was small but could have been pleasant. Instead it was chaos. Toys scattered like debris after a storm. Tin soldiers under chairs, blocks in corners, dolls with missing eyes. Dishes stacked in the sink. A pile of laundry on a chair near the hearth, clean, I think, but wrinkled and forgotten. Crumbs under the table. Mud tracked across the floorboards. And Margaret moved through it as if none of it mattered, as if it was simply the natural state of a home with living children. She poured tea, smiling, asking after my little ones, speaking of the weather. I could not hide my face. I looked around and I know, my disapproval was written plainly. I didn't say, "How can you live like this?" But my eyes said it, my silence said it. Something shifted in her, like a latch closing. Her smile stayed, but it became careful, polite. Her hands trembled just slightly as she set the cup before me. She talked too brightly for a while, then quieted. The warmth went out of the room, though the fire still burned. I left early with a stiff excuse about chores waiting at home. Margaret walked me to the door. She didn't ask me to stay. She didn't press a slice of cake into my hand. She simply said goodbye as if I were a neighbour passing through. I walked home angry. Angry at her disorder, angry at her carelessness, angry that she didn't feel shame. It did not occur to me, not even once, that perhaps she did feel it, that perhaps she had tried and failed and could not bear to explain herself, that maybe she was tired, that maybe her husband's scattered work and her 3 wild boys had drained her, and my silent judgment was one more weight she didn't deserve to carry. I told myself I was right. I began making small remarks after that. Not cruel, I thought, not unkind, just truth spoken plainly. Her boys needed discipline, her household needed managing, Daniel needed steadier work. They ought to save money instead of spending it on trifles. Margaret would nod and say, "You're probably right, Harriet." And then she would change nothing. It bewildered me, it infuriated me. If she agreed, why wouldn't she fix it? Why wouldn't she do what was proper, what was sensible, what was safe? I did not understand that Margaret did not live to satisfy a measuring stick. And I did not understand that every time I held that stick up to her, I was teaching her, quietly, steadily, that my love had conditions. I didn't know then what that would cost us. I didn't know that we were already stepping onto the road that would lead to silence. I only knew I was tired of watching her drift through life without consequence, tired of feeling like I had to be the one who held everything upright while she floated. And I believed, fool that I was, that being right was the same thing as being good. The breaking point came in 1876. I remember the year because the nation was celebrating 100 years, flags everywhere, speeches, talk of progress and pride. People acted as if time itself were a ladder and we were all climbing upward together. But in our family, time did not feel like a ladder. It felt like a circle, the same arguments, the same judgments, the same disappointments coming around again and again, only sharper each time. Mother's birthday fell in early autumn. She wanted everyone together, father, all of us children, spouses, grandchildren. She had cooked since dawn, refusing help the way she always did when she wanted to prove she still could. The dining room table was pulled out as far as it would go, and still it wasn't enough, so extra boards were laid across sawhorses and covered with cloth. The room smelled of roast meat and boiled potatoes and apple spice. We were all there crammed shoulder to shoulder, too many elbows, too many voices, children whispering and giggling until someone hissed at them to be still. Margaret arrived late, of course, not terribly late, late enough. She came in with her cheeks pink from the cold air, hair escaping its pins, boys trailing behind her like a little storm. Daniel followed, smiling, making some remark that had the younger women laughing. He always could do that, walk into a room and make people feel lighter, as if nothing truly hard could happen while he was present. Margaret took her seat, smoothed her skirt, and looked around the table as if she were taking in the sight of all of us with a kind of hunger. I can see it now, that expression, part joy, part nerves, part longing. Dinner began, plates passed, prayers said. Father carved the meat with his steady hands. We ate, talked, pretended everything was as it should be. And then Margaret mentioned it. Daniel had been offered a position, a real one, managing a store in Ohio. Steady pay, a future, a chance to build something that wasn't patched together from odd jobs and favors. It wasn't merely work, it was respectability, the very thing I'd always believed she was throwing away. Margaret's voice trembled when she spoke, not with fear exactly, but with the intensity of someone trying to sound calm while her heart is racing. She kept her hands folded as if to keep them from shaking. Daniel's hand rested near hers on the table, not touching but close. They would have to move, she said, leave Pennsylvania, leave the family, but it might be for the best, it might finally be the thing that changed everything. When she finished speaking, she looked around the table. She was waiting for approval. She was waiting for kindness. She was waiting for her sister, her older sister, to say, "I'm proud of you. I'm glad for you. I hope it goes well." And God forgive me, I spoke first. I don't know if it was because I wanted to protect her, or because I wanted to be right, or because something in me could not bear the idea that her way might succeed when mine had always been so carefully controlled. I only know the words came out of my mouth before I could soften them. "Ohio," I said, "that's a terrible idea." And then, as if I couldn't stop myself once I'd started, I added the cruelest part, the part that still burns when I think of it. Daniel will spoil it like he spoils everything else. And then what will you do? You'll be stranded out there with no family, no help, and nothing when it all falls apart. The room went quiet in the way a room goes quiet when everyone hears glass break. Forks stopped, chewing stopped. Even the children paused, sensing that something important had turned. Margaret stared at me. Her face drained of colour, then flooded with it. Her eyes shone, not just wet, shining with shock, with humiliation. Daniel's jaw tightened. He put a hand on her forearm as if to steady her, and he began to say something, some gentle protest, some attempt at peace. But Margaret stood so abruptly her chair scraped the floor. "We're leaving," she said, voice shaking. "Boys, get your coats." Daniel looked at her startled. "Margaret," he said quietly, "sit down. Let's finish the meal." But she didn't sit. She didn't look at anyone but me, and in her eyes I saw something I had never seen there before. Not annoyance, not hurt that would pass. Something colder. Something like a door shutting for good. She gathered her shawl with trembling hands. The boys were confused, asking questions. She snapped at them, something sharp and frightened, and they hurried toward the entry. Daniel rose too, his face carefully polite. He murmured an apology to Mother. "I'm sorry," he said, and his voice was controlled in a way that told me he was holding a great deal back. He followed Margaret out with the boys. The front door opened. A gust of air swept in. Then it closed, and the whole house seemed to shrink around the silence they left behind. Everyone looked at me. Father's eyes were hard, but not with anger, not directly. With that expression he used when he wanted order restored without discussion. Mother's mouth pressed into a line. My brothers shifted uncomfortably. Their wives looked down at their plates. George stared at the tablecloth, as if studying the pattern might save him from choosing a side. I felt exposed and defiant at the same time. "What?" I said. Someone needed to tell her the truth. No one answered. Father cleared his throat and began eating again, as if by moving his fork he could force the world back into its proper shape. Conversation crept back in little pieces, stiff, careful remarks about the weather, about the harvest, about anything but what had just happened. But the meal was spoiled. Everyone knew it. We left early. On the ride home, George said almost nothing. The wheels creaked, the horse snorted in the cold. The sky was darkening fast. Finally, as we turned into our lane, George spoke. "You were too hard on her, Harriet," he said. I stiffened. I was honest. "She's your sister," he replied. "Honesty isn't the only thing that matters." I said nothing then. I couldn't, because to say anything would have been to admit there was a part of me that already knew I had crossed a line I could not see in the moment. 3 weeks later, Margaret and Daniel moved to Ohio. They did not tell me. They did not come to say goodbye. I heard from Mother, who told me in a low voice as if speaking too loudly might make Father angry. Mother said Margaret was hurt, that she had cried when she packed, that she did not want to see me, did not want to speak to me, at least not then. I told myself I did not care. I told myself I had done my duty. I had warned her. If she chose to be offended, that was her weakness, not my fault. I told myself she was childish, dramatic, stubborn. But underneath, something else began to grow. A bitterness, yes, and something like fear. Because if she could leave, if she could truly go, then what did family mean? What did sisterhood mean? All my rules and standards and righteousness had always assumed the bonds were permanent, unbreakable, that people might sulk or argue, but they would return. Margaret did not return. Time passed. Mother sent occasional news, sometimes through a letter, sometimes through a remark when we met at church, sometimes through William, who stayed in touch with everyone. Margaret and Daniel were doing well in Ohio. The store was successful. Daniel, it turned out, was good at managing it, good with customers, good with accounts. The boys grew taller, healthier, they bought a house. Margaret had a garden. She joined a church, she made friends. Everything she had hoped for was unfolding. I told myself I was glad, but each piece of good news struck my pride like a pin, because it meant I had been wrong about Daniel, wrong about Ohio, wrong about the future I had predicted with such certainty at Mother's table. And if I had been wrong about that, what else had I been wrong about? I thought many times about writing to her. I would sit with paper and pen, the house quiet for a moment, children asleep, George out in the barn, and I would begin. Dear Margaret asterisk, and then I would stop. Because once you write an apology, you cannot pretend you never needed to. Once you confess you were wrong, you cannot shelter behind righteousness anymore. And I had built my entire life behind that shelter. So I folded the paper or tore it or hid it away. And I waited. I waited for her to write first. I waited for her to come to her senses, as I told myself. I waited for her to forgive me without my having to risk humiliation. That is what pride does. It convinces you that if you stand still long enough, the world will come to you and repair what you broke, without costing you anything. Years became a decade. Then, too, we grew older, our children grew up. The house felt bigger and emptier. The work changed shape, but it never truly stopped. And Margaret remained a name that was spoken carefully, if at all. Then Mother died in 1892. When you have lived as long as I have, you learn there are certain deaths that reorder the world. Mother's was one of them. She had been the quiet glue of our family, the one who smoothed edges, who made gatherings happen, who remembered birthdays and kept the recipes and the stories. At her funeral the church was full. People came who had known her as a girl. People brought food afterward and murmured about her goodness. Margaret came back from Ohio. I saw her across the church aisle before the service began. She looked older, of course, grey threaded through her hair, lines at the corners of her eyes. But there she was, unmistakable. The tilt of her head, the way she held herself, Margaret, my sister, standing in the same building where we had sat together as girls. Daniel stood beside her, still handsome in that worn way, though sorrow had hollowed his cheeks. Their sons were men now, broad-shouldered, quiet, looking slightly out of place among strangers. When Margaret's eyes found mine, my body went still. For one breath, one single breath, I believed she would come to me. I believed this was the moment that would loosen everything. This is what funerals do, I thought. They make people forget pride. They make people remember what matters. I took a step without meaning to. Margaret stared at me, and then she looked away. She did not come over. She turned slightly, guided Daniel and the boys to a seat on the other side of the church. They sat with their heads bowed. When the service ended, they moved quickly, almost urgently, toward the door. I watched her from behind, the back of her bonnet, the slope of her shoulders. She did not turn. She did not pause. She did not give me even the smallest opening. And I, stubborn to the end, did not follow her. I told myself if she wanted peace, she would offer it. So she left Pennsylvania again, without a word between us. 2 years later, father died. The same ritual, the same church, the same hymns, different faces, more grey hair. Margaret came back again, and again we did not speak. We stood in the same rooms, breathed the same air, and kept our distance like strangers who happen to share a past neither wishes to touch. My brothers noticed. They were not blind. Henry asked me quietly one day after father's funeral why Margaret and I never spoke. He looked uncomfortable, like a man stepping near a hornet's nest. It's complicated, I told him. It was a long time ago, he said. Yes, I answered, and that's why it stays where it is. He let it go. Everyone let it go. People do not like to interfere in a wound they cannot see, and so the silence was allowed to harden into something permanent. By 1900 I was 56, not young but not yet old, not in the way I understand old now. That was when the first message came that Margaret was sick. It was William who told me. He had received a letter from her, thin paper, shaky hand. Something wrong with her lungs, he said. Pneumonia, consumption, no one seemed certain. The words were always vague in those days until the body made the truth undeniable. She wants to see family, William told me. She asked if I could come. He watched me carefully as he spoke, as if he were reading my face for something I might not even admit to myself. I'm going, he said. Will you come with me, Harriet? I felt my chest tighten. My mind began immediately to stack up reasons, responsibilities, chores, grandchildren, the farm, the distance, the expense, the impracticality. All the proper reasons that can be used to avoid the improper thing, which is to feel. I can't, I said. William's eyes narrowed slightly. She might be dying. She's always been dramatic, I replied too quickly. She'll be fine. William was quiet for a moment. Then he said softly, She's your sister. Something in his voice, something like disappointment, made heat rise in my face. I have my own life, I snapped. I can't go running off to Ohio whenever Margaret decides she wants attention. William stared at me as if he didn't recognize me. And then he said nothing more. He simply nodded once, turned and left. He went to Ohio without me, and I went back to my kitchen, back to my tasks, back to the comforting tyranny of routine, telling myself again that I was right, telling myself there would be time, telling myself that if anything truly serious happened, someone would send word and then I would decide. That is the lie we tell ourselves to make postponement feel like prudence. A month passed. The days shortened, the air sharpened, leaves fell and the world began to strip itself down for winter. And then one Tuesday morning, William came to my house. He arrived earlier than expected, and when George opened the door, I heard the sound of voices, low, urgent, and then footsteps in the parlour. I was in the kitchen with my hands in dough, flour dusting my apron. The smell of yeast was strong, comforting, ordinary. George called my name. When I entered the parlour, William was standing by the window, not sitting. He stood as if his body refused rest. His shoulders were slumped, his face drawn with exhaustion, and there was something in his stillness that made my stomach drop before he even spoke. I knew before the words came. William did not turn from the window. And then he said, quietly, flatly, as if speaking louder would shatter what was left of him, "She's gone." "She's gone," William said again, as if repetition might make it easier to believe. I stood in the centre of the parlour with flour still on my hands, staring at my brother's back. For a moment I could not understand what he meant, not truly. My mind tried to place the words somewhere harmless, somewhere reversible, as if gone might mean she had stepped out, or moved again, or changed her mind about visitors. But you don't say it like that when you mean a person has simply stepped away. I heard myself whisper, "No." William finally turned. His eyes were red-rimmed and dull with fatigue, and in his face I saw something I had not seen in him since we were boys and girls, helplessness, not the kind men admit to. "She died 2 days before I arrived," he said. 2 days, Harriet, 2. 2 days. 48 hours. A small amount of time, that's what struck me. Not weeks, not months, 2 days, close enough to touch if you had reached sooner, close enough that it makes you feel as if the world is mocking you. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. My throat tightened so hard it hurt. William sat down heavily, as if his legs could no longer hold him. He took his hat in both hands and stared at it, turning the brim with his fingers. "I tried," he said. "I took the first train I could, but it wasn't fast enough, or I was." He spoke like a man confessing a failure. I sank into the chair across from him, though I don't remember deciding to. My hands rested in my lap. Flour fell in little white grains onto my skirt. "What?" My voice broke. I swallowed and tried again. "What happened?" William exhaled, slow and shaky. "She'd been sick for a while," he said. "Longer than she let on. Daniel said she didn't want to worry anyone. She kept saying she'd get better when the weather changed, when the spring came. But it didn't." He paused and rubbed his eyes with the heel of his hand like a tired child. "By the time I got there, she was already buried," he said. "The funeral was the day before, small, just Daniel and the boys and neighbours from their church. The minister said she was a good woman, that she brought light wherever she went." I flinched at that word, light, because it was the word I had always known was true, even when I was angry at her for it. William continued, quieter now. "Daniel took me to the grave," he said. "I brought flowers, white roses. Do you remember she used to pick them at Mother's place? She'd tuck them behind her ear and laugh when father scolded her for getting pollen on her dress. I did remember. I remembered too much. My chest felt as if it had been filled with stones. William looked up at me then, searching my face. He asked about you, he said. I stared. Daniel asked if you might come, William went on. He asked if you would want to see them. He didn't say much else, but I could tell he already knew. Margaret must have told him about the quarrel. My mouth went dry. What did you tell him? I asked, though I already knew. William's gaze dropped again. I said you probably wouldn't, he admitted. I didn't know what else to say. I didn't want to speak for you, but Harriet, I couldn't lie to that man when his wife was in the ground. A sharp, ugly sound came out of me, half laugh, half sob. Probably wouldn't, I repeated. It sounded like a judgment, like a sentence. And it was accurate. William sat forward, elbows on his knees, hat still in his hands. What happened between you two? He asked. His voice was not accusing, not exactly. It held a careful gentleness, the way you speak near a wound you don't want to reopen, but can't stop staring at. I tried to answer, I truly tried. But when I opened my mouth, the story that had lived inside me for decades, the dinner, the words, the pride, the years, rose up like water and I couldn't breathe. I shook my head once, small and helpless. Tears came fast, humiliating in their force. I covered my face with my hands, flour and all, and began to cry like I hadn't cried since I was a girl punished for something I didn't understand. William's chair scraped as he stood. He crossed the room and put his hand on my shoulder. He didn't press me, he didn't demand. He didn't say you should have the way I deserved to hear. He only stood there with his hand heavy and steady on my shoulder, and after a while he said, I'm sorry, Harriet. Sorry, as if Margaret had been mine to lose. But that was the terrible truth. In the end she had been. William stayed a little longer. He spoke about Daniel, about the boys. Daniel is broken, he said. He tries to be strong, but he's hollowed out. And the sons, those boys, worshipped her. They don't know what to do without her. The house feels quiet, Daniel said, too quiet, like the air itself is waiting for her laugh. At that, something in me cracked open wider, because I could hear that laugh in my own memory, bright and careless and warm, and I realized I had not heard it in 24 years, not once in the flesh. 24 years. A lifetime, really. When William finally left, he hugged me once awkwardly, as brothers do when they are not used to tenderness. He told George quietly at the door that he was sorry for our loss. Our asterisk loss. As if I had a claim to it. When the house went still again, I walked back into the kitchen as if drawn by habit. The dough sat where I had left it, risen now, swollen with yeast and warmth. The ordinary sight of it, the work waiting to be finished, felt obscene. I stared at it a long time. Then I pushed the bowl away and went upstairs. I sat on the edge of my bed, George's bed, my bed, the bed where 6 children had been conceived, and where I had lain awake through fevers and storms and arguments, and the dull ache of everyday life. And then the full weight of it struck me. Not simply that Margaret was dead, but what death meant in this case. It meant there would never be a letter answered, never be a knock at my door, never be a moment at church where she finally turned to me and said, "All right then, Harriet, enough, let's stop this foolishness." All the quiet fantasies I hadn't admitted I carried, that one day time would soften her or soften me, and we would speak again, collapsed in an instant. She was gone, and I had allowed the silence to become permanent while she was still breathing. I had always thought of death as something that came at the end of a long road, the final page after you had read the whole book. But Margaret died at 57. 57. Not a girl, no, but not old, not finished. The world had taken her while there were still things that could have been said. And I had not said them. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. My hands trembled. I could not pray. I could only think in a loop that had no mercy. I should have written. I should have gone. I should have apologized. George came in after a time. He sat beside me. Careful, as if approaching a skittish animal, he put an arm around my shoulders and pulled me against him. I resisted at first, not because I didn't love him, but because comfort felt like something I hadn't earned. I had built this sorrow with my own hands. I deserved to sit in it alone. But George held on. He didn't lecture. He didn't say, "I told you so." He only held me while I cried until my throat was raw. At some point in the night, words finally came out, broken, ugly, honest. "I ruined it," I said. "I ruined my sister." George's voice was low in the dark. "You didn't ruin her," he said. "I did," I insisted, fierce with self-hatred. "I took my pride and I used it like a weapon. I hurt her, and then I refused to fix it. I refused, George, I refused for 24 years. He said nothing for a long time. And then you were afraid. I turned my head to look at him. Afraid, I spat the word as if it were an insult. "Yes," George said. "You've always been afraid, afraid of being wrong, afraid of looking foolish, afraid that if you soften, the world will take advantage, afraid that if you admit fault, you'll be less of whatever you think you need to be." His words landed with a dull thud inside me because they were true. I had been trained to believe love was earned by correctness, that approval was a reward for obedience, that mistakes were dangerous because mistakes invited punishment. So I built a life where I could be safe, proper, responsible, predictable. And Margaret had lived as if love was something you simply gave, as if you didn't have to earn it by being perfect. I had envied her for that, and I had punished her for it too, without meaning to. The days after William's visit passed in a fog. I moved through chores like a sleepwalker. I fed my family. I spoke when spoken to. I nodded at the right moments. But inside I kept returning to the same images. Margaret at the dinner table in 1876, face going pale as my words hit her. Margaret in church at Mother's funeral, looking away from me. Margaret's grave in Ohio, with no one from Pennsylvania there except William too late with roses. And then, worse than images, memories. Margaret and I as girls, whispering in our shared bed. Margaret singing while she swept. Margaret laughing as she ran through the yard, with a ribbon trailing behind her. I had stored those memories away as if they belonged to someone else. Now they spilled out and cut me over and over. That was when the haunting began in earnest. Not the gentle kind of remembering people speak of, the kind that makes you smile sadly. No, this was daily, relentless. 30 years of waking and thinking, she is dead and I never said I was sorry. People think regret is a single feeling like sadness. But regret is many things. It is shame. It is rage at yourself. It is bargaining. It is replaying the same moment and trying to insert new words, as if the mind can stitch time back together through sheer will. I apologized to Margaret in my head until the apology became worn down like a coin handled too many times. Margaret, I was wrong. Margaret, I was cruel. Margaret, I loved you and I didn't know how to show it. Margaret, please forgive me. At first I imagined her answering. I imagined her face softening. I imagined that smile of hers, the one that could make you feel as if you were not beyond hope. I imagined her saying, "Oh, Harriet, it's all right." But imagination is both mercy and torture. Because when the day ends, the truth remains. She is not here. She will never speak again. And I will never know what she might have said. After some time, months, maybe a year, life forced its way back in. Children still needed counsel, grandchildren still needed care. Illness still came. Harvest still needed bringing in. The world does not pause because you have been a fool. But something in me had changed. Not in a grand, dramatic way. More like the slow shifting of a bone that has healed wrong and finally begins to ache enough that you cannot ignore it. When my daughter Anna came to me with a man she wished to marry, a man I did not care for, a man I suspected would make her life harder, my tongue rose to do what it had always done. To judge, to warn, to say the truth as I saw it. And I saw Margaret's face. I felt in my body the old scene, the table, the silence, the door closing. So I swallowed it. I smiled. I asked the young man questions. I invited him to supper. I watched him with a guarded eye, yes, but I kept my fear from becoming cruelty. Anna married him. And 20 years later they were still together, still steady, still kind to each other. He had been better than I expected. I had been wrong. And because I did not speak my judgment like a knife, I did not lose my daughter. When my son Robert announced he was moving to California, my first thought was that it was foolish, too far, too uncertain, too full of risk. I almost said it. I almost made the same mistake wearing a different dress. But then I remembered Ohio, and I remembered that the world is larger than my fear. So I hugged him. I told him I would miss him. I told him to write. I told him, awkwardly, because those words were not ones I had been raised to use freely, that I loved him. He wrote every month for years. He built a life. He came back when he could. And I learned, too late for Margaret but not too late for him, that love is not proven by keeping people close. Love is proven by letting them go without turning your worry into a punishment. People sometimes tell me I must be proud, having lived so long, having raised so many children, having kept my marriage for decades. And I suppose I am. But pride is a tricky thing. It can build a life, yes, and it can burn one down. The lesson I learned with blood in my mouth, as the saying goes, is this. You can be right and still be wrong. You can be correct and still be cruel. You can keep every rule and lose the only thing that matters. Because being right is not what holds people. Kindness holds people. Humility holds people. The willingness to say, I was wrong, before time seals the door. At 80 years old, I have buried friends, parents, neighbours. I have watched children grow into strangers and strangers become family. I have seen fortunes made and lost. I have seen men break under grief and women stand upright through things that should have flattened them. And still, when I lay awake at night, it is Margaret who comes. Not mother, not father. Margaret. Sometimes she is young again in our childhood room, hair loose, eyes bright. Sometimes she is the woman at that dinner table, lips pressed tight to keep from trembling. In the dreams I try to speak. I try to say the words that would have changed everything. But my voice won't come. My mouth moves and nothing happens. And then I wake with my heart pounding, the sheets damp with sweat, and the old truth settles over me like dust. It is too late. Always too late. I will carry this until I die. I know it. It will not be my accomplishments that rise up at the end, not the clean floors, not the well-fed children, not the years in church. It will be my sister's face and the empty space where my apology should have been. If I could speak to the girl I was, the young woman who believed she could protect herself with propriety, I would tell her to put down the measuring stick. I would tell her that standards are not the same thing as love. And if I could speak to the woman I was at 33 at mother's birthday table, I would take her by the shoulders and say, "Stop right now, before the words leave your mouth. Ask yourself if you want to be right or if you want to keep your sister." But I cannot speak to her. That woman is gone too. All I can do now is speak to whoever might listen. If there is someone in your life, sister, brother, friend, child, someone you have not spoken to because pride has dug its heels in, do not wait. Do not tell yourself you will fix it one day. One day is a lie. There is only now. Write the letter. Make the visit. Say the shameful words, "I was wrong, I'm sorry, I miss you, I love you." Say them while there is still a living ear to hear them. Because death is not like an argument. You cannot revisit it later when you feel calmer. And silence is not neutral. Silence is a decision. It is time passing without repair. It is a wound crusting over until it becomes part of the body. I thought time would soften the hurt between Margaret and me. I thought distance would cool our pride. I thought family bonds were unbreakable simply because they were called family. I was wrong. Time does not heal what you refuse to touch. Time only hardens it. And then, without asking your permission, time runs out. That is what they don't tell you when you are young. They tell you to be respectable, to be right, to keep order. They don't tell you that the truest duty, the one that matters when you are 80 and looking back, is the duty to love people more than your own pride. I failed Margaret in that duty, and I will regret it as long as I draw breath. There are people who will tell you regret gets lighter with time. They say grief dulls, that the sharp edges wear down, that the mind cannot hold pain forever at full strength. And for some things maybe that is true. When mother died, I cried, and then I stopped crying. When father died, I felt the strange relief that comes when a hard man is finally out of reach, and then even that relief faded into ordinary memory. But what happened with Margaret did not dull. It did not soften. It did not become a story I could tell without tasting bitterness. Because it wasn't only loss, it was failure. And failure does not fade the way sorrow fades. Failure sits down in the centre of your life and makes itself at home. After William told me, after the first days of shock passed, I did the thing I had always done when I did not know how to feel. I tried to make order out of it. I cleaned. I scrubbed the kitchen until my knuckles were raw. I shook out rugs. I boiled linens that did not need boiling. I rearranged shelves. I mended clothes that could have waited. George watched me uneasy. "Harriet," he said once gently, "you're wearing yourself out." "I'm fine," I answered too sharply, because if I stopped moving, I might have had to sit still long enough for the truth to swallow me. At night, when the house went quiet, the memories came in the dark like thieves. Not only the terrible ones, the dinner table, the church, but the small, ordinary ones that hurt more because they proved how much we'd once belonged to each other. I remembered Margaret at 12 years old, brushing her hair by the window and humming under her breath. I remembered her telling me she was going to marry for love even if she had to live in a cottage with a leaking roof, and me rolling my eyes as if she were playing at foolishness. I remembered the way she used to bring me little things without making a fuss, a ribbon she'd saved, a smooth stone she thought I might like, a sprig of mint from the garden because she knew I enjoyed the smell. She had offered affection the way some people offer bread, simply daily without tallying what it cost them. And I had responded with correction, with rules, with the tightness in my chest that I mistook for virtue. One night, months after William's visit, I went into the cedar chest at the foot of our bed. It held the old pieces of my life, folded quilts, baby clothes I couldn't part with, letters tied with ribbon. I don't know what I thought I would find there. A sign, perhaps. A proof that Margaret had not truly shut me out, that she had softened at the end, that she had said my name kindly at least once after she left. I found nothing like that. But I did find something else. A small bundle of paper tucked into the corner, wrapped in a handkerchief. Letters. Unscented letters. I recognized my own handwriting at once. Firm strokes, careful spacing, the style Mother had drilled into us. Dear Margaret asterisk. I sat on the floor with the chest open and read them one by one. Some were only a paragraph, abandoned mid-thought. Some went on for a page and then ended abruptly, as if my courage had run out and my pride had stepped in to finish the job. They were full of almost apologies, half confessions, careful words that circled the truth without touching it. I miss you. I think of you often. Perhaps we were both hasty. I hope you are well. I didn't mean. Not once did I write the clean, plain sentence that mattered. Not once did I put down my pride and write, I was wrong, I'm sorry. I sat there for a long time with the papers in my lap, and it struck me with a kind of sick clarity. Even in private, even with no one watching, I had still been performing, still trying to protect myself from the humiliation of full honesty. That is what it means when pride becomes a habit. It does not only control what you say to others, it controls what you are willing to admit in the quiet. George came to the doorway and saw me sitting on the floor with the letters. He didn't speak at first. He just leaned against the frame, his face heavy with understanding. After a while he said, "You meant to send them." "Yes," I whispered. "But you didn't." "No." He came in and sat on the bed, watching me. "Why?" he asked, not accusing, just asking. I opened my mouth, and what came out surprised even me. "Because if I apologized," I said, "then I would have to accept that I wasn't the good one." George frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" I stared at the letters until the words blurred. "All my life," I said slowly, as if speaking it for the first time made it more real, "I thought being good meant being correct. Obedient, proper, the one who never caused trouble, the one Father approved of. If Margaret was wrong, then I was right, and if I was right, then I was safe." I swallowed, my throat ached. But if I admitted I was wrong, I continued, then what was I? Just harsh, just jealous, just another woman with a mean tongue. George's voice was quiet. You would have been human. That word human landed hard, because it was the one thing I had been trained to deny. In our home you were not allowed to be human, you were allowed to be useful, you were allowed to be controlled, you were allowed to be obedient. Margaret had been human anyway, and I had punished her for it. A year after her death, I did something I had never expected to do. I asked George if we could travel to Ohio. He looked at me as if he weren't sure he'd heard correctly. Ohio, he repeated. Yes, I said, my voice shook. I want to see where she lived. I want to see her grave. George hesitated, not because he didn't want to go, he would have followed me anywhere, but because he understood the danger of it. You can think you want pain and then be surprised by how much you cannot bear. But he nodded. If it's what you need, he said. The journey was long and uncomfortable, even with trains and wagons and the small improvements the world had made by then. My bones complained. My stomach churned with nerves. I watched the landscape pass, fields, towns, rivers, thinking of Margaret travelling this same distance with Daniel and 3 boys, leaving everything familiar behind. She had been brave in a way I had never respected at the time. When we arrived, Daniel met us. I had not written ahead. I did not have the courage. I simply came, as if showing up could substitute for the years I had wasted. Daniel opened the door and stood still when he saw me. For a moment his face held nothing, no welcome, no anger, no softness, just a man looking at a ghost. Then his expression tightened, and I realized with a jolt that he had every right to shut the door in my face. But he didn't. He stepped aside. Mrs. Bennet, he said, formal, strained. Then, after a beat, Harriet. The sound of my name in his mouth made my eyes sting. The house smelled like soap and wood smoke. It was clean, cleaner than I remembered her old house being, but it had the hollowness William described. A place where laughter had once lived, now quiet as a church on a weekday. The sons were there, grown men now. They watched me with guarded curiosity. They had Margaret's eyes that nearly broke me. We sat in Daniel's parlour, and for a while we spoke of simple things, the journey, the weather, health. George did most of the talking because my mouth felt full of stones. Finally Daniel said softly, "She spoke of you." I looked up sharply. She did. Daniel nodded once. "Not often at the end," he said. "Not because she didn't think of you, because it hurt her." He cleared his throat, and I saw his hands clench on his knees. "But she spoke of you to the boys when they were young, told them stories, how you too were as girls." My heart pounded. "What did she say?" I asked, and my voice sounded like a child. Daniel's eyes flicked away. "She said you were the steady one," he said. "The one who always knew what to do, the one father depended on. She said you had a strong spine. She admired you." Admired me. The word made me flinch, because admiration was not what I had wanted from her. I had wanted her to bend toward my way of being, to validate my correctness by becoming like me. And Daniel added quieter, "She said you loved her, in your way." I could not breathe for a moment. Did she, my mouth trembled, did she ever say she forgave me? Daniel's face tightened with something like pain. "She didn't speak of forgiveness," he said. "She didn't speak of you as an enemy either. She just carried it, like a bruise you stop touching because it's always tender." I put my hand over my mouth as tears spilled. George's hand found mine under the edge of the chair, grounding me. Daniel watched me for a long moment, then stood abruptly and walked to the window. He looked out as if the view might steady him. "She cried after that dinner," he said, voice rough. "I'm not telling you that to punish you. I'm telling you because it was true. She cried because she wanted you to be happy for her. She wanted you to believe she could have a good life. She wanted," his voice broke, and he pressed a fist against his mouth. "She wanted her sister." The room swayed slightly. I had believed for years that I was the injured party. But hearing Daniel say it plainly, I finally understood what I had refused to understand. Margaret had been injured, and I had been the one holding the knife. "I'm sorry," I whispered. Daniel didn't turn. "I know," he said, and there was no softness in it, not cruelty either, just fact. "You're sorry now." That was the sharpest truth anyone ever spoke to me. Because he was right. Sorry now, after the cost had already been paid. Sorry now, when apology could no longer do what apology is meant to do. Later that day, Daniel took us to the cemetery. The air was cold and clear, the kind of day where every sound carries. Leaves skittered across the ground like little frightened animals. The headstones stood in rows, names worn by wind and rain. Margaret's grave was simple. Her names, her dates, a short verse. I stood in front of it and waited for something, some feeling that would make sense of my life, some moment of peace. People talk as if standing at a grave will deliver a clean, final emotion, closure. There is no closure. There is only the reality of earth over a body and the terrible permanence of it. I sank to my knees in the grass. George crouched beside me but did not touch me at first, as if he understood I needed to meet this alone. I spoke aloud then. For the first time in decades, I spoke to Margaret as if she might hear. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice was ragged. "I was wrong, I was cruel. I loved you and I didn't know how to show it. I let my pride make me hard, I let it take you away from me." The wind moved through the trees. Somewhere a bird called. Nothing answered. And yet this is difficult to explain. Saying it aloud changed something, even if it changed nothing. It did not bring her back. It did not erase the years. But it made the truth real in a way that thought never could. I stood, wiping my face, and looked at the carved letters of her name until my eyes ached. Then I said quieter, "You were right." I stayed there until my knees were stiff and my hands were numb. On the way back to Daniel's house we walked slowly. George kept his arm offered and I took it. I felt older than I had ever felt. That night Daniel allowed himself one small crack in his restraint. After supper, when the sons had gone out, he sat with George and me by the fire. His gaze stayed on the flames. "She asked about you once," he said. My heart jolted. "Near the end," he added, voice low. "She was feverish. She said your name, not angry, just tired, like she was calling across a field." I gripped the arms of my chair. "What did she say?" I whispered. Daniel swallowed hard. "She said, 'Tell Harriet I hope she's not lonely.'" The words struck me like a blow. Not lonely. As if her final worry was not revenge, not pride, not keeping score, but whether I would have warmth in my life. I began to sob then, openly, without dignity. George put his arm around me. Daniel stared into the fire with tears on his cheeks that he did not wipe away. The next morning before we left, I asked Daniel if I could have something of Margaret's. I did not know what I meant. A ribbon, a book, anything that had touched her hands. Daniel disappeared upstairs and returned with a small box. Her Bible, he said. She kept it by her bed. I took it as if it were fragile glass. The cover was worn, the edges soft. Inside, pressed between pages, were little things: a dried flower, a scrap of paper with a recipe, a lock of hair that must have belonged to one of the boys when he was small. And tucked in the back was a note, folded, written in Margaret's hand. My breath stopped. I opened it carefully, expecting, foolishly, some message to me, some final word. It was not to me. It was a list. Names of people she wanted prayed for. Daniel's name. Her son's. My brother's. Mother, even though Mother was already gone. And there, near the bottom, my name. Harriet. No explanation. No accusation. Just my name among the people she loved enough to remember in prayer. I held the paper and felt something collapse inside me. Margaret had not erased me. She had carried me even in hurt. And I had carried her only as a problem to be solved, a wrong to be corrected. On the journey home I did not speak much. George did not press me. He held my hand when the road jolted, and that was enough. When we returned, life resumed its demands, but I was changed in a way I could not undo. I began to say words I had rarely said before. To my children, I love you. To my grandchildren, I'm proud of you. But to my sons-in-law and daughters-in-law, thank you. Small sentences, simple, but for me they were like learning a new language late in life. And still, even with those changes, Margaret remained. Not as a sharp daily torment anymore, time does alter the flavour of pain, but as a steady weight, a reminder. I stopped telling myself the story where I was the righteous sister who spoke hard truths. I began telling myself the story that was actually true. I was a fearful woman who mistook fear for principle. I was a proud woman who mistook pride for strength. I was a sister who loved, but loved in a way that required the other person to be small. And Margaret refused to be small. Sometimes now, younger people ask me what my sister was like. They ask because they're curious about family, or because they've inherited her name, or because they've seen a photograph and want to know the story behind the face. I tell them she was bright. I tell them she had laughter in her bones. I tell them she was brave enough to leave home and build something new. And sometimes, only sometimes, when the room is quiet and the listener is old enough to understand, I tell them the truth that matters most. I tell them I hurt her. I tell them I waited too long to fix it. I tell them that you can do everything you think is right and still be wrong in the ways that count. And I watch their faces as they listen, and I can see them thinking of their own quarrels, their own silences, their own unsent letters. That is the only usefulness my regret has now, to serve as warning. Because regret, if it cannot change the past, should at least try to change the future for someone else. I am 80 now, older, truly older than the woman who first learned Margaret was gone. My hands are thinner, my eyesight weaker, my steps slower. People speak to me as if I'm fragile, as if age makes you delicate. Age does not make you delicate. Age makes you honest if you let it. It strips away the illusion that you have endless time to repair what you damage. If I have learned anything worth passing on, it is this: do not wait to become humble. Humility at the end of life is like rain after the harvest. It may be sincere, but it cannot save what is already lost. Say what you need to say while the other person can still hear it. Write the letter while there is still an address to send it to. Make the visit while there is still a door that can open. Because one day you will wake up and the world will look the same kitchen, the same bread dough rising, the same chores waiting, until someone steps into your parlour and says very quietly, "She's gone." And then you will understand, too late, that the only thing more painful than being wrong is being wrong forever.